Beneath the abandoned schoolyards and churchyards that dot Canada's landscape, rows of unmarked, child-sized graves lay deep below the soil, quietly hidden for generations. Inside these graves lies the truth behind the horrors Canada has hidden from its people and the world, with each body pointing to something far bigger, a century-long strategy that reached every corner of the country. Locked inside the DNA of those missing children is irrefutable proof of a calculated effort to erase Indigenous family lines from Canada's future. There were no battlefields or bombs, just government policies that tore children from their parents, surgeries that sterilized families and ended bloodlines, and intentional neglect that silenced 15,000 years of living memory. These forgotten graves are the epicenter of a nationwide erasure campaign that, over decades, reshaped the genetic map of an entire people and came perilously close to succeeding. Let's bring these stories into the light. By the way, before we get started, if you want to see more interesting stories about the genetic history of our ancestors, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Together, we can bring these hidden stories to light. Long before European ships appeared on distant horizons, the ancestors of Canada's Indigenous peoples had written their survival stories into their very DNA. From the Bering Land bridge crossings during the last ice age to the development of distinct populations across vast territories, these genetic lineages carried evolutionary wisdom accumulated over countless generations. The Inuit of the Arctic had developed genetic variants that helped them process seal fat and survive in temperatures that would kill most humans. The Ojibwe around the Great Lakes possessed genetic markers linked to wild rice digestion, perfectly adapted to their traditional food sources. The Beothuk of Newfoundland carried unique cold resistance genes that allowed them to thrive in one of North America's harshest climates. Each group represented thousands of years of genetic fine-tuning, biological libraries containing irreplaceable information about human adaptation and survival. But what had taken millennia to develop would be systematically destroyed in less than 2 centuries. When Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River in 1534, he encountered thriving Indigenous populations that may have numbered 2 million people across what would become Canada. These weren't scattered bands struggling to survive. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated societies with complex trade networks, agricultural systems, and population centers that rivaled European cities. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy controlled territories from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, their settlements housing tens of thousands. The Pacific Northwest cultures had developed salmon-based economies, supporting dense populations along major river systems. The Plains peoples had created mobile societies perfectly adapted to following vast buffalo herds. But by 1867, when Canada became a nation, only 125,000 Indigenous people remained alive. Population drops reached 90% in some regions. Entire genetic lineages, bloodlines that had survived ice ages and continental shifts, vanished within 3 generations. But this devastation was only the beginning. In 1876, Canada's Parliament passed the Indian Act, a document that would serve as the legislative foundation for systematic elimination. Unlike the brutal but obvious mass killings that characterized other historical atrocities, Canada chose a different path. One that would leave fewer obvious victims while achieving the same ultimate goal. The Act's architect was Duncan Campbell Scott, who served as Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932. Government documents discovered decades later revealed Scott's true objective: the complete absorption of Indigenous peoples until their distinct genetic signatures disappeared entirely. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, Scott wrote in 1920. What Scott had designed was genetic elimination on an unprecedented scale. Between 1874 and 1996, Canada constructed and operated 130 residential schools across the country, the world's largest system of institutionalized cultural elimination. But these facilities served a purpose far more sinister than education or even cultural destruction. They were designed to sever the biological transmission of Indigenous heritage across generation. The Mohawk Institute in Ontario, operating from 1831 to 1970, processed thousands of children through its halls. Students called it the mush hole for its starvation-level food rations, a deliberate policy that stunted physical development and reduced fertility in survivors. The Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia, where those 215 children now rest in unmarked graves, operated from 1890 to 1969, taking children as young as 4 from families across the interior plateau. St. Anne's Residential School in Ontario subjected children to electric shock experiments designed to cure their Indigenous identity. The Alberni Indian Residential School in British Columbia became synonymous with systematic abuse that affected nearly every student. The Gordon Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan operated its own cemetery, a grim necessity given the school's mortality rates. Government records, many sealed for decades, reveal mortality rates that expose the school's true purpose. At the File Hills Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan, death rates reached 69% in some years, meaning more than 2/3 of children admitted to the school died there. At the Sarcee Boarding School in Alberta, tuberculosis killed so many children that the facility was temporarily closed, only to reopen with fresh admissions. Each child who died represented not just an individual life lost, but entire genetic lineages that would never continue. Children who would have grown up to have families, passing down genetic variants that had survived in their bloodlines for thousands of years. While the world focused on the cultural destruction occurring in residential schools, Canada was quietly implementing something far more permanent. Hidden within medical facilities and government institutions, a massive sterilization program was systematically preventing Indigenous reproduction. The program's scope only became clear decades later, when survivors began speaking out and government records were finally released. What they revealed was a systematic campaign to prevent Indigenous peoples from having children, the ultimate form of genetic elimination. But the full horror was yet to be uncovered. In 1928, Alberta passed the Sexual Sterilization Act, creating the most aggressive sterilization program in Canadian history. The legislation established the Alberta Eugenics Board, which would go on to sterilize over 2,000 people over the next 44 years. Indigenous people made up only 2.3% of Alberta's population, but represented 25% of all sterilizations by the program's end. At the Provincial Training School for Mental Defectives, Indigenous children were routinely classified as mentally defective to bypass consent requirements. The sterilization program operated through a network of government-controlled medical facilities where Indigenous women were particularly vulnerable. At the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital in Edmonton, Indigenous tuberculosis patients were subjected to experimental surgeries, including sterilizations without anesthesia. Between 1949 and 1953, doctors performed 374 experimental procedures on patients, many of whom were sterilized during operations they believed were treating their tuberculosis. Patients were often hundreds of miles from their families, spoke little English, and had no advocates to question medical procedures. Dr. Adolph Lorenz, a prominent Vancouver physician, articulated the program's philosophy in 1926. Our sense of humanity is destroying humanity. We are allowing more and more of the poorer human stock to survive and reproduce. Sterilization, he argued, was the best method to decrease the number of feeble-minded being produced. But the program's true target wasn't the feeble-minded. It was Indigenous genetic heritage itself. British Columbia's Sexual Sterilization Act of 1933 created a more restrictive framework than Alberta's legislation, but the reality was equally devastating. Operating primarily through Riverview Hospital, the program sterilized several hundred people, with Indigenous women bearing the brunt of the targeting. Indigenous women admitted for depression, poverty, or simply having children outside marriage were routinely recommended for sterilization. Unlike Alberta's mass sterilization approach, British Columbia's program was more selective but equally effective in its targeting of Indigenous reproductive capacity. The horror didn't end with official programs. The elimination of Indigenous reproduction never actually stopped. It simply became more covert. Between 2008 and 2012, at least 60 Indigenous women in Saskatchewan were coerced into tubal ligations, often during childbirth when they were most vulnerable to pressure from medical staff. In 2017, Elisa Lombard was in labor at Saskatoon City Hospital when medical staff pressured her to sign consent forms for tubal ligation. She refused, but later discovered that many other Indigenous women had been sterilized under similar circumstances. Modern DNA analysis has revealed the catastrophic impact of Canada's elimination policies on Indigenous genetic diversity. Population geneticists studying blood samples and genetic data from Indigenous communities have discovered evidence of severe genetic bottlenecking, the scientific term for when populations become so small that genetic diversity collapses. The genetic signatures lost during this period included variants that helped Indigenous peoples process traditional foods, resist certain diseases, and survive in harsh climates. These weren't just interesting scientific curiosities. They were the accumulated genetic wisdom of 15,000 years of human adaptation. The complete elimination of the Beothuk people of Newfoundland provides the clearest example of genetic destruction. When Shanodithit died at the penitentiary in St. John's on June 6, 1829, an entire genetic lineage disappeared forever. Recent attempts by geneticists to extract DNA from Beothuk remains in museum collections have been largely unsuccessful, meaning their unique genetic adaptations are lost to science forever. The Beothuk possessed genetic variants that likely included enhanced cold resistance and possibly unique immune system adaptations. Governor Hugh Palliser reported in 1766 that the barbarous system of killing prevails amongst our people towards the native Indians, whom our people always kill. This systematic hunting drove the Beothuk into interior regions where they could not survive, leading to starvation and the complete extinction of their genetic lineage. Recent research has revealed an even more disturbing aspect of Canada's elimination campaign: the discovery that trauma can actually alter gene expression in ways that can be passed to future generations. This field, known as epigenetics, has shown that the abuse and trauma inflicted in residential schools literally changed how survivors' genes functioned. Amy Bombay's research at Dalhousie University has documented elevated cortisol levels, altered stress response genes, and compromised immune system function in residential school survivors. Most significantly, these epigenetic changes appear in their children and grandchildren, even when those descendants never attended residential schools themselves. Since May 2021, ground-penetrating radar surveys have detected over 1,800 potential burial sites at former residential school locations across Canada. Each location tells the same story: children who entered these institutions and never returned home. The discovery of these burial sites has forced Canada to confront the physical evidence of its elimination policies. But the genetic evidence tells an even more devastating story. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified over 3,000 children who died in residential schools, but acknowledged this was likely a significant undercount. Many schools destroyed their records, and deaths often went unreported to families or government authorities. Recent analysis of school records by historian Bryce Edwards reveals mortality patterns that suggest systematic neglect and abuse. Schools consistently reported higher death rates during winter months, when children were most vulnerable to malnutrition and disease. Yet these same schools continued to admit new students while failing to address the conditions causing deaths. Even today, research into the genetic impact of Canada's elimination policies faces systematic obstacles. Government agencies restrict access to genetic samples, limit funding for studies that might reveal the full scope of genetic damage, and classify research findings that could expose ongoing liability. Janet Smiley of the University of Toronto has documented how federal health agencies actively discourage research projects that connect historical policies to modern health outcomes. Funding applications that mention genetic impact of residential schools are routinely rejected, while studies focusing solely on social determinants receive approval. The suppression extends to access to historical record. The cover-up continues at the highest levels of government, suggesting that the full scope of Canada's genetic crimes remains hidden. Hidden in the DNA of Indigenous survivors are molecular signatures of trauma, genetic bottlenecking, and lost diversity that will persist for generations. Now, I know this video was a little dark, but I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. I've put a lot of work into this video. Please leave a like and comment your thoughts on the subject. This was Ancestry Code, and as always, thanks for watching.